Recording in progress.
Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Christine Coons again, and I wanted to share. I'm actually really excited to present this topic discussing sex. And please don't break into the song because that's just going to blow this whole entire idea up. But um, this is one of those topics that has been on my mind as of recent, and has been in the media a lot as of late as well. And the challenge with defining sex is that it's a very complex topic, even though we would like to keep it as simple as possible. Um, so, without much further ado, I want to dive right into this discussion and see where it takes us. This is about me. I'm a board certified physician in internal medicine through the American College of Osteopathic Internists. I've been practicing as a hospitalist for about 10 plus years, give or take a year, somewhere in there. I was a former chief resident at Grandview Hospital in Dayton, Ohio, and I also teach medical students through the Pacific Northwest University Medical School in Yakima, Washington. We don't have any financial disclosures. I don't get paid doing this. This is something that I want to do and enjoy doing, actually. I absolutely enjoy teaching medical students, and it's a thrill for me. I enjoy that interaction. As I was contemplating this topic, I actually recalled a quote by Elder President Gordon B. Hinckley, former president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And I'm going to do a slight modification of this quote, only because I do think it's very applicable here. True love is not so much a matter of romance as it is a matter of anxious concern for the well-being of one's companion. And I wanted to modify this just a slight little bit. Instead of well-being of one's companion, change it to the well-being of our neighbor. In the New Testament in the Bible, the God commands us to love God and to also love our neighbor. And I think this anxious concern is very applicable. Um, how can we best support and serve those who are around us? And I think one of the things that's important to do is start developing some understanding. Sometimes breaking the ice with just asking a few simple questions and then also listening to what has to be said and sharing with one another who we are. Anxious concern. So here's the definitions of sex, and this is a slight variation on what Webster's dictionary will use, but I think this does a great job of capturing the entirety of what we're trying to get across with male versus female. And there's a couple of words in here that are very important to understand. So a male is the combination of characteristics and their variations which support sperm production. And a female is the combination of characteristics and their variations which support egg production. When we look at the gametes, eggs and sperm, they're really the biggest difference is actually size. And that's how we actually looked at them from the get-go in biology. Now, in different circles, we define sex slightly differently. This is a medical biologic definition, recognizing that there are variations of what this overall characteristics can be. It's a combination of characteristics. So some of them can be present, some of them can be absent, but the overall categorization is to support sperm production, even though that may not be there's some individuals that actually cannot produce sperm, or some individuals that cannot produce eggs. When we look at human sex development, it becomes one of the more important things to look at is every human starts out embryologic life as bipotent. And what that means is that both males and females have the structures for both male and female anatomy. And that happens approximately 5 to 6 weeks in embryologic life. And I think that's really important to understand is that the structures and even most of the genetics are actually there for both of those structures to exist at the same time. There are dozens of genes involved in sexual development, not just the XY or the XX chromosomes, but there's a lot of chromosomes involved where these genes are located. there are indeed various significant variations from the definitions, the strict definitions of male and female. And I think the last bit of this is to recognize that gonadal development and brain development roughly coincide with each other at about that fifth and sixth week of embryologic development. And the gonadal development has a very strong influence on brain development. This next slide has a lot of just letters and numbers attached to it. But the top part is it's not just the XX chromosome or the XY chromosome. And this is a list of approximately 100 different genes that are involved in sexual development. And for some medical students out there, you might recognize some of these. AMH or anti-Mullerian hormone is up towards the top. The SRY gene, SOX9, SPI-L, STAR, even the core genes are very commonly talked about in medicine. But if you individually look at each one of these genes, they are involved in sexual development, and each one of these is associated with conditions of complete sex reversal or variations of that in between. Of interest, there are only two genes, and really actually only one, that are on the Y chromosome, and that's the SRY gene. TSPYL 1 and 2 have analogs on the X chromosome, and they're named TSPX to represent that they're on the X chromosome instead of the Y, but they're roughly analogous to each other. So really, in all reality, the SRY gene becomes a very strong focal point of sexual development. It's almost like a on-off switch, if you will. And the amazing thing with this is this on-off switch turns on an amazing array of machinery. It's almost like walking into a warehouse and you're getting ready to turn on some big, huge production line, and there's one switch that does it. Um, this slide is one of the most amazing slides that I've been able to discover. I love this slide. This is a diagrammatic representation of sexual development. And if you look at the bottom of this diagram, you can see that this is a course of approximately 16 weeks of gestational development. So when the egg and sperm combine to about 16 weeks, there's a lot of things that happen in between those 16 weeks. Up at the very top, you see these different stages. And at the very far left, you see this indifferent stage. And this is what I was talking about with this bipotent stage, that every human starts out with these structures of both male and female potential to develop into these different pathways. Um, at the left, at the very top of that little diagram there, you can see Mullerian duct. This is the structure that leads into female anatomy. Down a little bit farther, you see the Wolffian duct. That's the pathway that leads down to the male anatomy. But all the structures are there to develop either way. As you go through the top pathway, you see the SRY gene, that important gene on that Y chromosome that turns on and flips on and off the light. However, if you can look, there's actually multiple genes that are influencing the SRY, and the SRY leads to the activation of SOX9. Now, if SRY is the light switch, SOX9 is probably the most powerful gene in this pathway that activates male development. One of the key things with this SOX9 gene is that it actually sends itself into a feedback loop. SOX9 activates SOX9, and you can see that with that arrow looping back on itself. As SOX9 activates, and I love this little bubble, it activates other genes. What other genes? Well, there's a whole list of them right there. There's a huge, massive array of genes that are involved in male sexual development. Not all of these are included in male development. Some of these lead to female development, but many of them are actually on this list. So what they do here is they say other genes just so they don't have to list every single other gene that's out there. The next step along this pathway is looking at that anti-Mullerian hormone, or that AMH. So in the process of activating male development, it's important to realize that this anti-Mullerian hormone goes back to those Mullerian ducts and shuts it down. So not only do you have to activate the male pathway, but you have to deactivate the female pathway. If everything works the way it's supposed to, you end up with male genitalia. If things don't work the way they're supposed to, let's say there's a mutation in any one of these genes, the pathway can be disrupted. It can be affected by the female pathway and vice versa. As you go down to the female pathway, you'll see those red lines that go back and forth. These red lines represent this repression, this pushback against the other pathway. So even from the female pathway, there is this repression of the male pathway that goes on. WNT4, RSP01, a FOXL2 actually go up and inactivate SOX9. As you go through the female pathway, since there's no anti-Mullerian hormone, there's no androgens, the expectation is that the female structures ultimately develop. So the key piece behind this entire diagram is this right here. Human sex development is not only defined by the progression and growth of the appropriate sex pathway, but regression of the opposite sex pathway. Any cause of variation of this development process, either genetic or environmental or any other pathway that can disrupt this, can significantly affect the human sex anatomy and brain development. When we look at males and females, there are certain key characteristics, sex characteristics, that help us define male versus female. And this table actually represents this idea, this concept between these different structures. It's not unusual for people on media to say, well, a female is somebody who has XX chromosomes, or male is an XY chromosomes. There's somebody that produces eggs or sperm, or they produce estrogen and testosterone. All these things are technically true, but they're incomplete and not taking the entire picture into account. So as you look down the left list, the left column there, you see the external anatomy, the internal anatomy, gonads, gametes, chromosomes, and hormones, and their respective sex in the next categories. What needs to be mentioned with this is that there are variations of how these interact with each other. You can technically have a male who has XXY chromosomes. You can have a female who actually has XY chromosomes. Maybe that SRY gene that leads down to that pathway somehow misplaces itself and puts itself on an X chromosome, subsequently leading to somebody with XX chromosomes but developing as a male. Any one of these structures can be there or not be there in some form or another. So in terms of trying to define male versus female, sure, this list is helpful with completely defining this, recognizing that there are variations of these developments that need to be accounted for. An interesting fact is that male sex development tends to involve more cell division and growth with that external anatomy, so it is easier for interruptions of the male development pathway. And if you go back to that pathway, you'll see that there's a lot of genes that are involved in there. And if you have interruptions, for example, in SOX9 or CBX2 or GATA4, this pathway gets interrupted. SOX9 is unable to get activated, and the anti-Mullerian hormone doesn't get activated and regresses the female line. As a consequence, the default pathway pushes itself through the female line. During the development of the gonads and the brain structures themselves, there's a period of time where there's a flood of hormones, and in particular testosterone, that has a strong influence on the brain development. This leads to masculinization of the brain or feminization of the brain at this time. Sometimes this surge of hormones can be interrupted, maybe by external factors. Maybe the timing of it is late, maybe the timing of it is early. And I think what this really ultimately describes is that there's a lot of things that are going on in development. And I think a lot of women who have been pregnant know that during early gestation, there's a lot of things that can influence a baby's development. And we have to be careful with the things that we prescribe to pregnant individuals because we know that there is potential for side effects. When we look at other individuals, unless we're a physician or a sexual partner, we typically are not aware of the primary sex characteristics. And in general, we only know the external sex characteristic and not the internal anatomy. When we look at other humans, we tend to see the secondary sex characteristics. And this is only a partial list of those. But we look at facial hair, breast growth, face shape, body fat distribution, hip and pelvis development, and stature. We can look at voice and inflection and all these other characteristics that kind of clue to us that this individual most likely is male or most likely female. If we look at an individual and we see a beard, we say, oh, chances are that person is male. However, we also have to keep in mind that there are definitely females out there that grow facial hair. And as a consequence of some of the genetics that they do have. Then, for example, with breast growth, there are young men during the course of puberty that may develop breast growth, also called gynecomastia, which may or may not regress. This next slide captures the idea that the brain and even the gonadal tissue are very much interrelated. They're separate organs, but they are connected and they are influenced on each other. At the very top, you see the hypothalamus and the pituitary, which are located towards the center of the brain, roughly behind the eyes. The hypothalamus secretes a hormone called gonadotropic releasing hormone, and that affects the gonadotropins, which are luteinizing hormone, LH, and follicular stimulating hormone, FSH. These hormones then subsequently go down to the gonads, and they influence them to produce testosterone and estrogen, respectively. This is also the reason why women get their menses cycle is through these cyclic pattern releases of LH and FSH. What's interesting with this is if you notice down at the testosterone and estrogen, they loop back to the brain, suggesting that there is a feedback loop. That as testosterone is released into the bloodstream or estrogen is released into the bloodstream, they go back and they do influence the brain, which does have estrogen and testosterone receptors. So the one thing that this slide shows is sex development is complicated. There's a lot of things involved in our sexual development that's way more complicated than just saying somebody is XY or XX. We've talked about brain being an influence in our sexual development. We talked about the gonads being a part of our sexual development, including the anatomy. I haven't touched on the adrenal glands as part of this, but the adrenal glands are also an influence on our development and even leading into puberty. This leads to the question about differences in sexual development. If you go back to that table and you look at each one of those structures that define or help define male versus female, you realize very quickly that there are indeed variations of how these sexual characteristics do develop. There are individuals out there with varying hormone levels because of the genetics that they were given at birth. There may be environmental influences that come in and play a role in the midst of all this. We commonly see differences of sexual development at birth. This is where commonly called intersex conditions. We look at the gonads and say, well, this is not what we expected. They're not clearly male, they're not clearly female. They're somewhere in between. And there's graphs and diagrams online that are readily available that show that there's these gradations of male versus female. Sometimes these things are not readily available at birth. Sometimes it's not until puberty that we realize that this individual actually has an intersex or a difference of sexual development condition. One of those examples is guaidoses, which is a relatively not infrequent occurrence in the Dominican Republic. Guaidosis is a condition of 5-alpha hydroxylase. And basically, what happens is individuals are assigned female at birth. They have female appearing anatomy. And as they hit puberty, these individuals are XY and they start developing male anatomy. They start developing a penis, their testes start descending, and they go on the rest of their life, typically growing up as male. Sometimes these conditions are not recognized until later in life, after somebody gets married and they work to try having children. Unfortunately, some of these individuals are not able to bear children because of whatever genetic condition that they had growing up. They often get a little bit of a surprise. Um, Sometimes they realize that their chromosomes are the opposite of what they expected. But this is part of the reason why we have these fertility clinics is to help make these diagnoses. And sometimes these conditions are never quite identified for whatever various reasons. Maybe they just weren't quite apparent at birth. Maybe the variation of the proteins, the genes that were there at birth, weren't quite uh, changed enough to for them to be manifest. And maybe sometimes we find these just routine labs. So just like variations in a person's appearance, there is a significant variation of sexual development from one person to the next. It's not the same from one person to another, and there's a lot of strong influences that are at play here. Keep in mind, appearance of a person is sometimes a poor surrogate for identifying differences of sexual development. Going back to the secondary sexual characteristics, we don't see enough we don't sorry we don't see people's primary sex characteristics. We often see them well clothed. We see them through body shape and clothing, voice, mannerisms, all these things that lead us to suggest that, hey, this person may be male or this person may be female or somewhere in between. So I want to take a look back at those definitions at the very beginning and revisit the fact that sometimes these sex definitions are actually hard to define. It's not simply production of sperm or eggs, though we use this in biology and medicine to make these categories. There is indeed a significant portion of the population that has variations from these definitions. The next bullet point is a important thing to point out that people who are born with these variations of male and female development often experience a lot of stress and anxiety because of these conditions. They often can experience depression, they can often experience suicidal ideation. So, being mindful of some of these individual variations that they had done to them, or that was no fault of their own, that they were born this way because of the gene mutations that they have. And we are seeing a lot of this actually start to happen in social media where people are facing discrimination because they don't meet the criteria of a quote unquote true female, where they have all the anatomy and parts that are associated with that, or a true male. For example, somebody who is assigned male at birth, maybe they were born without testes. They're already anxious and depressed enough as it is, being born the way they were, realizing that one, they cannot have children. Maybe somebody with, as they become intimate, will make a notice of this and ridicule them for that. So there's a lot of people out there that try to keep these things low key. They try to keep them secret and not necessarily make it open to the rest of the world. Again, we make assumptions. We look at somebody's visual characteristics or we listen to their voice and we make these assumptions that somebody is male or female based off of a lot of these things right here, including those secondary sex characteristics. We've been talking a lot about the physical aspect of the human body. Gender identity is this innate sense of self. This is what happens inside the brain and is a lot influenced a lot by our brain development during gestation. Gender identity can be a man, it can be a woman, neither or both. It depends on how the brain is developed or other external influences that can have play in the midst of all this. There are indeed sexual differences between male and female brains. Realizing that the overall structure of the brain is identical with small, minute variations between males and females. They're not huge differences, but they are definitely there. On average, and I can't stress this enough, on average, females had greater volume in the prefrontal cortex, orbital frontal cortex, superior temporal cortex, lateral parietal cortex, and insula. Males had a greater volume in the ventral, temporal, and occipital regions. What they did is they took about 1,000 some odd individuals. They did MRIs of them, including functional MRIs, to compare and contrast the electrical activity between male and female brains. And this is where they noticed the differences between the two. There were several individuals who donated their bodies to science. And as we were able to analyze their brains, we looked to see if there was any gene receptors inside the brain, especially these structures that correlated with male and female development. Indeed, there were. So our brains and many parts of our body have um, testosterone receptors or they have estrogen receptors. Brain is no exception. There are different receptors in various parts of our brain that do correlate. So I hope with this next slide that this gathers a whole picture of an individual. And I think that's the important thing with this is to look at an individual as a whole. This is not just individual parts, but to look at somebody and say, you are a person, you are a human. And as a consequence of that, you deserve to be loved and respected for who you are. And the very center of this is gender identity. And this is what we talked about with this sense of self. This is how their brain developed. This is who they are internally. And sometimes this jives well with their body, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes they express themselves in different ways and saying that I'm neither male or female. I don't want to be recognized as either or I want to be recognized as both at the same time. Looking back at each one of these individual structures that correlate with our primary sex characteristics, any one of these could have disappeared or altered and switched and caused problems with development. So all these things lead together to our gender identity. So the biggest takeaway from this diagram is to look at somebody as a whole. Over to the right, I have a couple definitions. Gender expression is how a person presents themselves as a reflection of their gender identity. And then sexual orientation is the romantic attraction from one person to another. I show this picture to demonstrate an amazing fact of our human population, and that is the diversity of humanity. As you look at each one of these individuals, you will notice variations in face shape. Maybe their jaw is a little bit different. Skin tone, skin color. You look at their hair. Sometimes they have hair, sometimes they don't have hair. Sometimes they have a beard, sometimes they don't have a beard. Maybe they're wearing glasses, maybe they don't need to wear glasses. The amazing thing is each one of these individuals is a human. They deserve respect. They deserve to be loved for who they are individually. And I think going back, looking at all of the stuff that I presented, I hope what this does is it shows that our humanity, our diversity that we have in this world is unique from person to person. I hope that allows us to look at different cultures, different languages, and realize that there's incredible beauty in the differences that are there, especially the positive things. On this last slide is my references. And I wanted to point out the fourth one. I found this actually to be very insightful. Gene.io is a website designed to take human genomes and make it presentable in such a way that they can analyze gene sequences and look for errors along the way. And this is what I used actually, or used to gather all 100 of those genes that I listed earlier. And if you go to this website, you can actually you can use test data. It's free, You click the test data button, and up at the very top, there's a button that says phenotype. You scroll down to sex reversal and you change the number of genes listed to 100, which is the max. And over in the left-hand column, it will list out 100 different genes associated with sex reversal, which also correlate with sex development. I want to thank you for your time. I hope this presentation has been helpful and insightful, and I thank you again. Bye.